Hey everybody, and welcome back to Rambling Through History. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to talk about a famous World War I regiment, which was also known as the Harlem Hellfighters. From their humble beginnings to the very victorious end, and also how they broke through the mold of African American soldiers not being brave or being good soldiers. Hopefully you guys will enjoy today's video, and if you do, please like and subscribe, hit the bell notification, and enjoy. The Hellfighters originated as the 15th New York Colored Infantry Regiment, or a National Guard unit. Members of the African American community in New York City's Harlem district had long advocated for the creation of a homegrown military unit, but politicians blocked several attempts at establishing such a body. On June 2, 1913, a bill authorizing an African American National Guard regiment finally passed the New York State Legislature, and Governor William Slizzer signed it into law. However, the 15th New York existed in name only until June 1916, when Governor Charles Whitman appointed William Hayward, his former campaign manager, to serve as its commanding officer. Hayward had been a colonel in the Nebraska National Guard, and he, like most of the field-grade officers in the unit, was white. Hayward proved to be an adept organizer, and he recognized the importance of incorporating African American soldiers into the unit's officer corps. An early addition was Charles Fillmore, a Spanish-American War veteran who had been instrumental in the campaign to establish an African American regiment. Fillmore was commissioned a captain and made a company commander. However, despite an endorsement from the New York Age, arguably the most influential African American newspaper of its era, the 15th New York had trouble meeting its recruiting targets. At full strength, the regiment would field several thousand men, but by the end of the summer of 1916, only a fraction of that number had enlisted. The regiment's fortunes turned around with the enlistment of James Reese Europe in September of 1916. Europe was a giant in the music scene of the earliest 20th century. He was a gifted multi-instrumentalist and a composer, as well as a tireless champion of African American music and musicians. Europe was also the band leader for Vernon and Irene Castle, one of the most famous dance teams of the age. Like many in New York City's African American community, Europe had initially been lukewarm to the notion of military service. The segregated armed forces offered limited opportunities for African American troops, and Europe's was the toast of American high society. He had more than a dozen orchestras performing under his banner in 1916, and his creative energies were fueling the transformation of ragtime into jazz. When Europe told his friend and collaborator Noble Sissel that he had joined the 15th New York, Sissel countered that running Europe's musical empire had left neither of them with any time to devote to the army. Europe responded by telling Sissel that he would be joining the unit as well. Europe was painfully aware of the prejudice that he and his musicians faced. They were routinely played at the estates of the wealthiest families in the United States, but never entered through the front door. Lynchings were commonplace, but US President Woodrow Wilson had not yet publicly denounced them. In the 15th, Europe saw an opportunity to create a strong, powerful institution for the development of the manhood of Harlem. Europe told Sissel that our race will never amount to anything, politically or economically, in New York or anywhere else unless there are strong organizations of men who stand for something in the community. Sissel was receptive to this argument, and he enlisted the same day. Recruitment, however, continued to be hampered by the 15th's limited resources. In an effort to boost his unit's profile, Hayward looked to the 8th Illinois, the only other African American regiment in the National Guard, for inspiration. The 8th Illinois had a concert band of national renown, and Hayward had Lieutenant Jim Europe at the head of one of his machine gun companies. The solution seemed obvious, but Europe had a reputation to uphold. If he was going to establish a regimental band, he told Hayward that he would need the freedom to make it the finest in the army. Hayward secured $10,000 to fund the band. Europe was made band leader, and Cecil promoted to the sergeant and made drum major. Europe spent months recruiting the country's finest musicians to its cause, and he personally led a trip to Puerto Rico to fill his reed section. While Europe was building his band, the United States entered World War I. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, and the following month, the 15th New York reported to Camp Penskill, New York, for a short course of rifle training. The regiment was officially mustered into federal service in July and ordered to Camp Whitman outside of Poughkeepsie, New York, for basic training. It soon became clear to Hayward, however, that the 15th would be held apart from the rest of the army. when the so-called Rainbow Division, a collection of National Guard units assembled from more than 24 states, marched down Fifth Avenue in a farewell parade. Hayward reportedly was told that the 15th could not be allowed to join them because black is not a color of the rainbow. The men of the 15th would face even worse treatment in their next posting. In October 1917, they were ordered to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and harassment and verbal abuse became a matter of routine. The men of the 15th recalled the events of 1906, when whites in Brownsville, Texas had framed a group of African American soldiers for a crime they did not commit. Just 2 months prior to the 15th's arrival in Spartanburg, racial clashes between African American soldiers and whites in Houston had claimed 20 lives. Hayward, hoping to avert another such tragedy, traveled to Washington, D.C. to make a direct appeal to the Secretary of War that the 15th be relocated or deployed to France at the earliest possible date. Hayward was en route to Washington when Cecil was assaulted by a white man while purchasing a newspaper from a stand in a hotel lobby. Soldiers from the 15th and New York 12th, a white unit that was billeted next to them, converged on the scene to retaliate on Cecil's behalf, and the violence was averted only by the timely intervention of Europe. Europe interposed himself between the assailant and dozens of enlisted men and defused the situation until military police could arrive. The 15th returned to New York in short order, and they were transported to France. Having arrived in the port of Brest on December 27, 1917, they were sent to Saint Nazaire, hundreds of miles from the front, and put to work on engineering projects that would pave the way for the larger body of U.S. troops to come. After a month went by with no new orders, Hayward recognized that the very real possibility that his men would be trading their rifles for shovels for the duration of the war. With the regimental band spreading the ragamites throughout France, Hayward used their fame on his appeal to American Expeditionary Force Commander General John J. Pershing for a reassignment to combat duty. The campaigns of 1917 had been especially sanguinary for the Allies, and they had been imploring Pershing for reinforcements. Pershing, as a point of national pride, remained committed to the notion of a single body of American troops under American command. He had pledged some element of support to the French. However, the 15th New York was ready and able. In March 1918, the unit was redesignated the 369th Infantry Regiment, and the following month it was attached to the 16th Division of the 4th French Army under General Henry Gourard. The French had fully integrated African colonial troops into their army for decades, so the men of the 369th found greater acceptance in a foreign army than they had in their own. After a period of French language and tactics training and intense drilling with the French Lebel rifle, the 369th was ordered to the front in the Champagne region, on the western edge of the Argonne forest. From 1918, the 369th would spend 191 days in combat, a longer span than any other U.S. unit. As German General Erich Ludendorff's Spring's offensive hammered the Allied lines, the 369th developed a fearsome reputation amongst its enemies. It was the Germans who first applied the Hellfighters moniker to the unit, and the 369th's performance on the battlefield showed that the nickname had been well earned. On May 18, 1918, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts of the 369th were on sentry duty when their post was attacked by a German patrol. The two men fought off as many as 24 Germans in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Johnson sustained 21 wounds in the engagement, and the French military awarded him the Croix de Guerre avec Palme for bravery. Although Europe continued his duties as a band leader, he also spent time at the front in command of his machine gun company. In June 1918, he was wounded in a German gas attack near the town of Maufricourt and was evacuated to a field hospital behind the lines. While he was recuperating, he wrote, "On Patrol in No Man's Land." The song's upbeat tempo starkly contrasted with its lyrics, which is a harrowing depiction of the encounter with the enemy. It was one of the several songs that Europe would compose about the war. All of No Man's Land is Ours described a soldier's first call to his sweetheart, and How Ya Gonna Keep 'Em Down on the Farm was a playful tune about the appeal of Paris in contrast to life at home. The latter song carried a subtle political undertone. How could returning African American soldiers be expected to accept lynchings, institutional racism, and Jim Crow laws as a fact of life after they had tasted equality overseas? After his recovery, Europe would be ruled unfit for combat, and he would spend the next 2 months leading the 369th band at performances before enormous crowds in Paris. The German Spring Offensive had experienced localized successes against the fatigued Allied lines. Hoping to achieve a breakthrough before the American presence grew to an insurmountable size, Ludendorff pressed on with one final attack in July of 1918. The 369th suffered murderous shelling from the Germans at the Second Battle of the Marne, but their line held. As the Allies prepared for a counterattack, the 369th was reassigned to the French 161st Division, and it was with this unit that they would participate in the meuse-argonne offensive. On September 29, 1918, the 369th captured the town of Schlot, France, but suffered some of the heaviest losses of any American regiment in the process. In his account of the engagement, Major Arthur Little described his battalion's losses as hideous and continuous. Amongst those wounded was Corporal Horace Pippin. His depictions of his wartime experience would make him one of the most widely acclaimed African-American painters of the 1930s. On October 6, 1918, the French 161st Division was relieved and the badly mauled Hellfighters were withdrawn to the rear. For its performance, the entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre for valor. After several days of rest, the 369th returned to the lines in the Vosges Mountain as the Allies' advance continued. Sporadic fighting continued to take a toll on the unit, but news of an armistice spread quickly amongst the men. After November 11th, the 369th transitioned to occupation duty, and Hayward would personally lead the first American unit to reach the Rhine. The men of the 369th spent some 3 weeks occupying towns on the west bank of the Rhine, and in early December 1918 they received orders to march west to board trains for Brest. It took almost a month to reach the French coast and several more weeks before passage could be secured for the journey home. But by February 1st, 1919, the 3 battalions of the 369th were on their way back to the United States. The achievements of the 369th Infantry Regiment had been heralded in the American press, and when the troops arrived in New York between February 9th and February 12th, the Harlem Hellfighters were greeted as returning heroes. Denied a place in the 1917 farewell procession, the 369th on February 7th, 1919, paraded victoriously up Fifth Avenue, displaying its decorated regimental colors to a crowd of hundreds of thousands. The parade continued north up Lenox Avenue, which is now Malcolm X Boulevard, through the heart of Harlem. With Europe directing the regimental band the whole way, upon entering Harlem, Europe led the band into Here Comes My Daddy Now, and wives, parents, and children lining the parade route rushed to embrace their loved ones as they passed. The 369th Infantry Regiment was officially demobilized on February 28, 1919. Europe and Cecil returned to work almost immediately, and on March 16th they launched a tour with the Hellfighters band with a triumphant performance at the Manhattan Opera House. They played shows throughout the Northeast and Midwest, and Europe was making plans for a world tour when, on May 9, 1919, he was stabbed by a member of his own band after a concert in Boston. Europe died just hours after he was waiting to be honored by Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge in a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial to Colonel Robert Coolidge Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The wreath was instead laid on Europe's casket as it made its way through the streets of Harlem. The Hellfighters band accompanied the funeral procession in silence. And with that, thank you guys so much for coming and enjoying this video with me. Please remember to like, subscribe, and to hit that bell notification, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.